It's 1892, and Andrew Carnegie is at the height of his power. One of the richest men in America, he's becoming publicly involved in foreign affairs and politics. In fact, battleships clad in his company's steel would soon devastate Spanish armadas in both Cuba and the Philippines. But despite being on top of the world, Carnegie's newly acquired Homestead Steel Works was beginning to threaten his reputation. The devastating, bloody strike that took place there that summer was putting Carnegie's entire brand in jeopardy. But the seeds for this bitter conflict between labor and capital were planted long before the Battle of Homestead. They were cultivated decades earlier amidst the friction between two business partners turned bitter rivals. Andrew Carnegie, the infamous financier and deal maker, and Andrew Kloman, a generational metallurgical genius. You've heard of Andrew Carnegie, but how much do you know about Andrew Kloman? Well, stay tuned for the untold story of the mechanical brains responsible for Carnegie's massive empire, and how the rivalry between these two men planted the seeds for what would become one of the deadliest workplace wars in American history. You're watching Those History Guys. Kloman and Carnegie were both similar men. For instance, they were both born in Europe and migrated to the States in their youth. Kloman was born in Prussia in 1827, and Carnegie was born 8 years later in Scotland. When these two young Andrews journeyed across the Atlantic for a new home, they found when they got there a young Pittsburgh that was made out of just stone and timber, in an America that was only just beginning to manifest her destiny. It was the mid-19th century, and over the past 100 years, this burg had transformed from a forgettable frontier town at the foot of a British fort to a formidable factory city of over 10,000 inhabitants. Pittsburgh's mines, furnaces, and factories churned out the tools and weapons required of westward expansion and were carried deep into the heart of the continent's interior on wooden steamships. The young Carnegie got his first job working as an industrial laborer, working alone in a basement, feeding wood chips to the boiler of a steam engine for a factory that made bobbins, or spools of thread. He would not work here for very long, as he soon got a lucky break thanks to his uncle, Thomas Hogan, who hooked him up with a job delivering messages for the O'Reilly Telegraph Company. Carnegie, eager to learn and practically obsessed with pleasing his superiors, quickly rose the ranks to become their chief telegraph operator in Pittsburgh. A frequent customer of the O'Reilly Telegraph Company was Tom Scott, the superintendent for the Western Division of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He learned the name of the young man taking his messages and would often request Carnegie specifically. Eventually, Scott realized he probably needed his own telegraph operator, so he poached Carnegie from the O'Reilly Company and brought him over to the Pennsylvania Railroad. Thanks to his job, Carnegie received a true, hands-on education that exceeded anything he could have learned in the tiny, one-room schoolhouse in Dunfermline, where he received his few years of formal schooling. According to his biography by Joseph Wall,
"Few men in Pittsburgh could have had a broader knowledge of the total business activity of the city than this 18-year-old boy."
Andrew Kloman, on the other hand, was not quite so lucky. While Carnegie was blessed with the opportunity to work at one of the biggest, most important companies in the state, Kloman had to earn a hard living in the fiery iron furnaces of the Allegheny Valley.
In 1858, Andrew Kloman and his brother Anthony opened up a small iron shop in the town of Millvale, just up the Allegheny River from Pittsburgh. With just a single trip hammer powered by one steam engine, the two brothers figured out how to make a living turning scrap iron into railroad axles. And the two brothers were complete opposites. Anthony was easygoing, trusting and eager to make friends at local saloons. It was he who first became acquainted with Thomas Miller, the man who will eventually bring Carnegie into their business. Andrew Kloman, on the other hand, didn't care much to make many friends. He was reserved and careful, maintaining a measured distance from what he still saw as the suspicious inhabitants of a foreign land. The Kloman brothers, Andrew and Anthony, would be brought into contact with the Carnegie brothers, Andrew and Thomas, during a year of great consequence for American history, 1863.
The same year that Union and Confederate troops blasted and bayoneted each other by the tens of thousands on the fields of Gettysburg. 4 immigrants in an iron forge 300 miles away were forming a partnership which would define the next period of American history. But to understand why this small iron business would become so important, we need to rewind to when the Civil War began in 1861.
Most fighting during the American Civil War took place on the rolling Piedmont hills of Virginia or the wide, flat river plains of the deep American South, where both Union and Confederate generals moved their troops around like chess pieces on open terrain. There were no battles in Pittsburgh. Moving an army across the formidable Appalachian Mountains before an era of mechanized infantry was costly and deadly. I mean, just ask General Braddock. Despite this, Pittsburgh was arguably the most important city in the entire Civil War because it was the hub of the Union's manufacturing. And both the Kloman brothers and the Carnegie brothers would hitch their wagon to this rising star, and they would all profit immensely from wartime manufacturing. Railroad was the word of the century, and Lincoln knew that this war would be won by whomever could best manage the movement of guns, soldiers, and supplies across the thousands of miles of continent across which the young nation was beginning to sprawl.
So Lincoln enlisted the help of Tom Scott, the newly hired superintendent of the Western Division of the Pennsylvania Railroad, who quickly brought his trusty assistant, Andy Carnegie. At just 25 years old, Carnegie got on a train to meet his president and serve his country. When he arrived, there was a major problem. Troops from northern states like New York and Massachusetts couldn't make their way south to protect the capital, as pro-Confederate sympathizers in Maryland were destroying railroad infrastructure.
But Carnegie and Scott had operated a railroad through Pennsylvania winters. They knew how to deal with damaged track better than anybody. One day, while in the front cab of a locomotive carrying the troops of New York's 7th Regiment, Carnegie noticed that the telegraph line had been staked into the ground, making the line useless for communication. He ordered the train to stop, and in his excitement, he pulled the stake up out of the ground without stepping back, and the wire flew up and slashed his cheek, giving him the red badge of courage he would forever claim made him
the first man to be wounded in defense of the nation's capital.
Hundreds of other men on this transport, though, would suffer wounds far more deadly in a bloodbath that would become known as the First Battle of Bull Run, a calamity which proved to both sides of the war that this would not be any quick summer campaign, but a grueling era of violence. For another 2 months, Carnegie continued to serve his country in the U.S. Telegraphers Corps, often taking messages from President Lincoln himself, until the side effect of a midsummer sunstroke meant that Carnegie couldn't stand the stagnant summer heat in Washington any longer. So he returned to Pittsburgh and continued to serve his country, albeit from the home front, further away from the dying and fighting.
As a tide of bloodshed swept over the United States, so too did a tide of investment capital flow like steam through the machinery of Pittsburgh's workshops, transforming credit and raw materials into profit and guns. The labor of men like Andrew Kloman, who toiled away in the city's furnaces and foundries, formed the fertile ground on which the seeds of investment from men like Carnegie would flourish into a towering empire of industry.
During the Civil War's 4 years of massacre and manufacture, Carnegie maintained his position at the Pennsylvania Railroad, viewing it as his patriotic duty, while spending his free time frantically managing his assets in a plethora of other interests like oil, train cars, bridges, and of course, iron. By this point, Carnegie had also invested in a rail axle company, one of the finest around, owned by a pair of Prussian brothers, Andrew and Antony Kloman. Carnegie became involved thanks to a friend of his, Thomas Miller, who had already invested $1,600 into the business so that the brothers could buy a second trip hammer to meet the increased demands of wartime production.
As the pressures of business grew, there was soon a falling out between Thomas Miller and a bookkeeper working at the Kloman shop called Henry Phipps. And Andrew Carnegie then was called to arbitrate the dispute. It was then, in 1863, during the height of the Civil War, that Carnegie would draw up a new agreement between the principal investors of the Kloman shop. This would prove to be one of the most consequential business dealings of his entire life. Andrew Kloman was skeptical of this ambitious young entrepreneur who had so suddenly invaded his business, even installing his own brother into the company under the guise of peacekeeping. Furthermore, Carnegie was a young man who knew little about forging, smelting, or manufacturing. He simply seemed to have a keen eye for emerging markets. 1864 brought confirmation that Carnegie was a skilled speculator. Eager to expand his iron output to help bolster his interests in the Keystone Bridge Company, Carnegie opened the Cyclops Iron Company in direct competition to the Kloman shop. With the Carnegie brother now involved in two competing corporations, it didn't take very long for the two entities to become one. Kloman and Phipps merged with the competing Cyclops Iron to form the Union Iron Mills in 1865, named in honor of the newly preserved nation that Northern industry helped to protect.
Carnegie and Kloman would remain business partners for years, though Kloman would remain suspicious of Carnegie's true motives. After the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia fell in April of 1865, Carnegie resigned from the Pennsylvania Railroad and decided to pursue a peacetime career as a full-time businessman.
And though he didn't know it at the time, this decision would one day realize the dreams of the industrial North by definitively proving to American society that free labor in a free market, and not caste slavery, was the winning strategy of business in the more enlightened modern era.
Carnegie and Kloman would grow their iron business together, Kloman in the machine room and Carnegie in the office. Kloman,
A mechanical genius.
in the words of Carnegie, spent day after day in the inferno of the mill, devising and implementing new ways to improve the quality of their product. For instance, when the Union Mill hired a recently immigrated German worker, Kloman was able to reproduce, by verbal description alone, a device which had already been implemented in Europe called a universal mill, which allows an operator to more precisely alter the thickness and length of finished iron plate. It was said that Kloman could, at a glance, determine if a competitor's operation could outproduce his own. Carnegie took advantage of Union Mill's technological superiority to win a contract to build a bridge over the Mississippi River at St. Louis in 1867. He also made himself a key fundraiser for the bridge, traveling to Europe to sell bonds to the London financier J.S. Morgan, father of J.P., to support the project.
Just 5 years later, while the bridge was undergoing its construction, Carnegie returned to Europe where he learned of a new process for making steel, devised by the English engineer Henry Bessemer. Determined to be the first American to utilize this technology at a commercial scale, Carnegie began construction of a state-of-the-art steel mill on the site of Braddock's Defeat just outside of Pittsburgh. His partners in his iron company, though, viewed this new technology suspiciously, but following Carnegie's lead, they joined him in this risky new steelmaking venture.
Andrew Kloman was inexperienced with steel, and he had to accept a backseat role to Captain Bill Jones, a Civil War veteran and Carnegie's first pick for mill superintendent. Perhaps trying to imitate the strategy of his colleague-turned-boss, Kloman would use this time to try for himself to be a venture capitalist. The mid-1870s were a risky period for American business. After the threat of civil disunion had passed, the market became so rife with speculation and fraud that it took all the mettle of an experienced captain like Carnegie to stay afloat amidst the storm of expansion and recession that racked the growing U.S. economy. Kloman did not possess the business acumen of his boss and would capsize financially in the waves of uncertainty.
Kloman was extensively involved in the iron business in the UP of Michigan, so much so that the town of Republic has a street and a bridge named in his honor. In the Upper Peninsula, he invested heavily in two businesses, called the Cascade Iron Company and the Escanaba Furnace Company, which claimed to be ventures for the mining and smelting of iron ore in Upper Michigan.
But Kloman forgot to read the fine print. He failed to notice that there was no limited liability clause in the contract. So when both businesses failed during a recession in 1875, Kloman was on the hook for everything. What's more, he had backed up his investment with his assets in the Carnegie Steel Company, meaning that his shares were at risk of being repossessed to pay off his debt. Carnegie, facing the prospect of having one of his primary partners fall in debt to a rival iron business, bought out Andrew Kloman's position in the company, effectively cutting him out. This saved the shares from falling into the wrong hands, but at the cost of alienating one of his longest-serving and most loyal business partners. When Kloman demanded to be let back into the company, Carnegie offered him $100,000 of stock, a fraction of his original position.
Kloman was not happy. He had seen his wealth grow immensely by toiling away almost every day for a decade in the heat of the iron furnaces. And now, this high-heeled, boot-wearing, soft-handed money trader had the audacity to oust him from the business that he helped start?
Carnegie later expressed remorse for this separation. In his autobiography, he said, quote,
I never regretted parting with any man so much as Mr. Kloman. His was a good heart, a great mechanical brain, and had he been left to himself, I believe he would have been glad to remain with us.
Andrew Kloman, however, was done dealing with Carnegie. Luckily for him, though, a man of Kloman's skills was needed elsewhere. On a flat river plain on the south shore of the Monongahela, just a ferry ride across from Carnegie's new Edgar Thomson Works, a group of investors formed the Pittsburgh-Bessemer Steel Company in a growing town known as Homestead, Pennsylvania. Kloman would oversee the construction of this facility, which he boasted would be capable of producing 50,000 tons of steel rails and 30,000 tons of structural steel per year, exceeding the capacity of Carnegie's operation across the river. The plant went up at an unprecedented speed. While the Edgar Thomson Works took 3 full years to finish its construction, the mill at Homestead was cranking out rails and beams a mere 15 months after the property was acquired. Again from Joseph Wall's biography of Carnegie.
It was as if Kloman, driven on furiously by his own internal demons, knew that he did not have a moment to lose if he was to enjoy that revenge for which he thirsted.
But he could not outrun his demons. In 1880, shortly before the Homestead Mill was to be completed, Andrew Kloman died of liver cirrhosis. With the absence of its skilled supervisor, Pittsburgh-Bessemer Steel Company had a rough start. Carnegie, once again, came in to save the situation. He bought out the shares of the initial investors, who felt lucky to be free of such a trouble-ridden business. Only one investor, W.H. Singer, stayed with the company. His initial $50,000 in stock grew to be worth over $8 million. With Carnegie's acquisition of Kloman's rival enterprise, the bitter rivalry between these two men was finally over. Carnegie, the younger and healthier, won simply by outlasting Kloman. But managing the Homestead Works proved so wrought with difficulty, it was as if Kloman's very ghost haunted the plant. Homestead had some of the highest levels of union representation of any plant in Carnegie's company, and the wages they had to pay were, in the eyes of the new management, exorbitant. Shortly after the expulsion of Kloman from the business, Carnegie began shopping around for a new partner, someone younger, hungrier, and more ruthless than he. In 1887, he found this in Henry Clay Frick, to whom he began to bequeath more and more corporate power. If you've watched the first video on this story, you know how this goes. During a dispute over a new labor contract, workers are locked out of the plant, and in the ensuing violence, more than a dozen people are killed. The event brought shame and infamy to Carnegie, who had long promoted himself as a captain of industry and friend of the worker. In his 1886 collection of essays, The Gospel of Wealth, Carnegie seemed to indicate sympathy for worker solidarity, saying,
"There is an unwritten law among the best workmen. Thou shalt not take thy neighbor's job."
But at Homestead, he allowed Frick to do just that to the striking workers, and what's more, stir them into violence. In the wake of this disaster, the world began to see Carnegie as a cruel boss, a callous hypocrite who let his lapdog Frick drive the workers into a frenzy. In his native Scotland, the Edinburgh Dispatch scathingly wrote,
"We on this side of the Atlantic, where the bitterest labour quarrels have never attained such a degree of intensity as exists at Pittsburgh, may well feel thankful that neither our capitalists nor our labourers have any inclination to imitate the methods which prevail in the land of triumphant democracy."
The world was beginning to see through Carnegie's shallow persona of magnanimity, to see him the way Kloman had seen him, a man of ruthless ambition who wouldn't hesitate to betray those whose labor, toil, blood, and sweat added comma after comma to his accounts. Carnegie's public relations nightmare after Homestead shocked him. He realized the damage done to his reputation could not be mended by words. He would have to take real action to show people the character he wanted them to remember. After all, he was getting old and only had so much time to make things right.
8 years after Homestead, Carnegie had completely retired from the business. He sold his immense pile of vertically integrated trusts to J.P. Morgan, who organized it into the company still known today as U.S. Steel. Carnegie's payout from this deal was $225 million, a full percent of the U.S. GDP that year.
With Carnegie hitting the retirement jackpot, he donated almost all of this immense fortune to be used in the funding of schools, libraries, and public works all across Pittsburgh and all over the country.
Many of these flagship institutions still bear their name of their donor. It hasn't gone anywhere. But then again, neither has the infamy associated with that name. Despite generations passing between now and the deadly events of 1892, its impact can still be felt. Many of us still remember the Battle of Homestead as it continues to shape our politics and our culture to this day. The debate over Carnegie's legacy, an inferno which began after the first shots rang out at Homestead, still continues to smolder despite the Steel Titans' attempts to smother it with vast charitable contributions. Andrew Kloman is buried at the Allegheny Cemetery at Pittsburgh, overlooking the river whose life-giving waters brought coal, iron ore, and business to his tiny iron company almost 2 centuries ago. He built no libraries and no schools. Nothing in our city bears his name except this headstone. His legacy remains one of quiet, unremembered toil and dedication to his craft and to an industry. He's neither lauded nor denigrated, but his name, rather unlike Carnegie's, can remain at peace.